it's interesting because I'd intended earlier on at some point to talk about editing, because editing is such an important part of what I do as a filmmaker. And you can imply things without actually saying things, which is again what we're talking about. Is there a process that you go through as an editor, or how would you work with other authors?
Editing is crucial, I think. I mean, that's where the poem or the film or the photograph is made. I mean, the first flush, especially for poems, it's a very messy kind of uh, assemblage of words and phrases. It's all kind of piled up. Think of it as the lump of clay, which then the sculptor goes and chisels and shapes with their hand or the stone. It's very similar. So you start eliminating things that is extraneous, or you start adding things that might add a bit of color or weightage, depending on what you want. So it's probably the most important part of the process. Of course, the base has to be very good. I mean, the idea needs to be good, the writing should be good, or the film or the photography should be good for you to have, you know, the editing is process number two, but a very, very important process. I mean, I go through so many drafts of a given poem. I mean, I throw away most things. I mean, I don't throw everything away anymore, but I don't necessarily choose to publish everything I write. um, because it needs to transcend beyond just your story. Otherwise, it's too much about you. And then what's the point? I mean, my story to myself is very boring. If it has to be reasonably interesting, then it has to be done in a way that people can relate to. And also the authorial stance, you have to bury the ego somewhere. You can't speak down or talk down. You have to speak as equals or together or as a community. Then I feel it's much, much more effective, because it can't be prescriptive ever. You can have a strong point of view, but if it's conveyed softly and reasonably and as a sensitive human being, then I think it's much more effective. Those things are much more powerful anyway. Um,
Obviously, I've just been in your audience today, and I know that from editing film, I've become the first audience to many of the filmmakers I've kind of worked with in the past. Are there other ways that you engage with the audience to to gauge their ways of thinking that might be interesting to talk about?
Yeah, so part of the editing process is I have a set of people who I would show my drafts to, people I trust. And they're not necessarily writers or filmmakers. They're just people who just are sensitive. And often they give me a very good feedback that, and I'm talking about, very fine-tuned things like, I mean, a lot of my final edits are to do with whether a semicolon should change into a comma or should I replace it with a long dash, so that I have more visual space, and the visual space would then give me an elongated breath pause. So those are very, very minute things. But simple things like, sometimes you're very close to the text and you don't see it. Even after editing it, you realize you haven't actually edited it out because you're probably emotionally very close to it. So it takes someone else to just tell you, hey, listen, you said this twice, maybe, or thrice. Ah, of course, yeah. So I have a set of trusted people who probably read. And as you grow older, you have less and less of that because you're much more in control of your craft. But the craft is very, very important. And listening to other people who you trust is super important because we are all flawed people. I mean, perfection is not achieved, singularity. I mean, I owe it to the audience. I mean, the audience also partly makes what a book is. If it wasn't for their support and their appreciation, you know, I can just read it to myself and say, well, it's great, but really, So yeah, we are all part of the same community. Each one has a different task. We all have a different role. So, and it's very, very important to listen. Often people don't listen. They love to proclaim. Talking and conversation is, I find it very interesting, but didactic proclamation is problematic. In fact, the first instinct is okay. You don't want to hear it because someone's really talking about it. And as the saying goes, you can't command respect. You can't demand respect, but you can command respect. That can be done very softly. Just thought, George, I'd like to talk about another aspect. We're talking about, a lot of the beautiful things in life and how things ought to be. But with the beauty, there's also grimness. There's always the other side of the coin. So, for instance, even though I come from a country where community means a lot, there's a lot of people, you're less likely to feel lonely and so on. But then too much of noise and people can be problematic too. So, for instance, when my mother died, uh, you have to go through some basic rituals of, there are rituals of burial and burning and feeding people and so on. And it was an eye opener for me because even I, for the first month, didn't have any time to grieve for my own mother because everything was so public. First of all, I mean, the day my mom died, I wasn't in the country, so I had to fly in. And then I saw my mother in the frozen in the morgue. But before I could even touch her, I had to sign all the hospital bills, pay all the dues. So it was all very strange. I mean, here I am trying to kind of, but of course the system is such that I can't even see the body. So all that is done, fine. I get the body out, and then there's a whole ritual, few days, where there are these pujas and ceremonies and beautiful things, of course. But and you feed people, the community is there, everybody's coming and giving you condolences, and it's all good, except that my relationship with my mother, I mean, I've not had the space to even shed a tear because I'm running around doing things. And the most ironic thing is, my mother is not officially dead until I have a certificate from the municipal corporation that the death certificate, and it's only after having 3 copies of that that she's really dead and valid. I just find it very, very odd and strange that we have to live with this kind of dichotomy. But that's where the poem comes from. And I thought that shows another side of our cultural space, really.
And just before you start, what is interesting is that I've had a similar experience with my father and my father-in-law passing away, and we went through, in our culture, the same thing.
Mm.
So that was an interesting thing to hear.
Yeah. So it's simply called Ma, which is mother in Bengali. As if in a dream, you disappeared unannounced, untimely, and unprepared. The handwritten diary you left behind weepingly revealed your sordid, searing pain. Grief struck, I run around the city's municipal offices, rummaging through bureaucratic files, seeking your death certificate for validation, as if losing you wasn't loss enough.
I would normally, actually, it's quite funny because I'd normally ask a question if there's anything that you'd like to close with, but that's actually a very nice way of closing.
I think,
unless there's something else you would like to.
No, I think that's the closure, which is perfect. It's paying respect to my parents. Basically, made me what I am. I owe them everything.
Yeah.
Had it not been for them and their generosity, I wouldn't be where I am. And what else can I say? I think silence is louder, so it's best left
Absolutely.
in that space, because in silence we have everything.
Sudeep, that was lovely. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
Really, my pleasure. I enjoyed it very, very much, and what a treat. This is what's more important, the connection.
Thank you.
We have more on the way, so please subscribe to this channel and check out the link below if you'd consider becoming a patron to help us keep making more content. Thanks for watching.